In the spring of 1887, on the eastern edge of the Bitterroot Valley in the Montana Territory, a stone building stood at the end of a cart track that no one had walked in years. It was small and squat and ugly, with walls 3 feet thick, and a roof that had begun to sag, and the men of the town of Cordell called it the Powder House, because that was what it had been built for. The mining company that raised it had stored its blasting powder there, far from the houses, in the years when there was still ore in the hills. The company was gone now. The ore was gone. The powder house remained, full of nothing but dust and the smell of old stone, and when the county put it up for sale to settle a tax lien, the bidding began at $6 and stopped there, because the only person who raised a hand was a young woman the town had already decided was a fool. Her name was Hannah Sayer, and she was 28 years old, and she had come to Cordell that winter with one trunk, a leather tool roll, and almost nothing else. The sale was held on the porch of the county land office, a clerk reading the parcels off a list in a flat voice, while a dozen men stood in the thawing mud and waited for the lots worth bidding on. The powder house came near the end, after a strip of bottom land and a half share in a sawmill, and the clerk read its description without looking up. A stone structure of 1 room on a 1/4 acre, encumbrance settled by sale, opening bid $6. He said the figure, as a man says, a number he expects no one to take, and for a moment no one did. Then Hannah raised her hand. She did it without flourish, the way she did most things, and the clerk peered at her over his spectacles as if he had misread his own list. The men at the auction laughed when she paid her $6, because they knew what she did not seem to know, that the powder house could not be moved, could not be farmed, and held nothing a sensible person would want. One of them, a heavy-set man named Del Harker, who owned the freight barn, told her she had bought herself a very expensive cellar. Another said she could keep her potatoes cold in it for the rest of her life, and asked whether she meant to live in it or only visit. A third wondered aloud, loud enough to carry, what a young woman wanted with a powder magazine when there was no powder and no mine and no one fool enough to have sold it to her but the county itself. Hannah counted out her coins onto the clerk's table, $6 in silver, and waited while he wrote the receipt. She folded the receipt and put it in her satchel and said nothing, because she had learned long ago that the people who laughed loudest were the ones who had never looked closely at anything. She had also learned that there was no profit in answering them, and a great deal of profit in letting them go on believing they understood you. What the town did not know, what no one in Cordell had reason to know, was that Hannah had not bought the powder house for the building. She had bought it for what she believed lay underneath it. And by the time the summer was over, she would prove that the thing the county had nearly given away held a truth heavy enough to undo a man who had spent 20 years believing himself untouchable. Stay with me, because the story of how she did it is the kind worth sitting still for. Hannah had been raised east of there in a river town in the Dakota country, by a man who was not her father by blood, but who had become her father in every way that mattered. His name was Eli Frost, and he had been a stonemason and a well-digger, and in his last years a man the territory called when something built underground had gone wrong. He could read the ground the way other men read a printed page. He knew how water moved through rock, how a foundation settled where a builder had cut a corner, and where a builder had told the truth. He had no children of his own, and when Hannah came to him at 9 years old, orphaned and silent, he did not try to make her into something she was not. He taught her instead. He gave her a small mason's hammer with a worn ash handle, and he told her that the handle would teach her hands what her eyes could not yet see. She had worked beside him for 19 years. She had learned to lay stone and to read it, to find the seam in a wall and the weakness in a floor, to tell dressed rock from fieldstone and old mortar from new. She had learned to mix mortar by feel in the cold, to dig a footing that would not heave with the frost, to set a cornerstone so true that the whole of a wall would rise honest from it. and she had learned the thing Eli prized above all others, which was patience. He used to say that the ground kept its secrets the way an honest man kept his word, which was to say it would give them up only when you had earned the right to ask. She remembered him kneeling at the lip of a failed well, one summer, a younger man than she ever truly knew him, running the soil between his fingers and saying that most men dug straight down because they were in a hurry, and that the ground rewarded the one who first learned which way it wanted to be opened. "Take your time with a thing," he told her, "and it will tell you how it was made. Force it, and all you will ever learn is how it breaks." He died in the winter before Hannah came to Cordell, of a cough that settled in his chest and would not leave. She had nursed him through the last of it in the small house by the river, and she had watched a man who could read the earth lose the strength to lift his own hammer. And she had not wept where he could see her, because he had taught her that grief, like everything else, was a thing you did with your hands and not your mouth. He left her the tool roll, the ash-handled hammer worn smooth at the grip, and a single folded letter she had not yet found the courage to open all the way. She had read the first page in the days after the burial, and then folded it shut again, because the first page had asked something of her, and she had needed the winter to be ready to answer it. It was the letter that had brought her to Montana, not the whole of it, for she had read only the first page, but enough. In it, Eli had written of a job he took in his younger years, before Hannah knew him, in a mining town in the Bitterroot. He had been hired to build a powder magazine for a company called Varon and Slade, a stone building with walls 3 feet thick, set apart from the town for safety. He had built it well, the way he built everything. Yet in the letter he wrote that he had built something else into it that the company did not ask for and did not know of, and that he had carried the weight of it for the rest of his life, and that if she ever had cause to go to that valley she should look beneath the floor in the northeast corner, and she would understand. So Hannah had come. She had spent her last weeks of travel money to reach Cordell, and she had waded through the tax sale, and she had raised her hand at $6, and now the building was hers. She did not tell the men at the auction any of this. She let them laugh. She walked the cart track out to the powder house in the long light of an April evening, and she stood before the heavy plank door with its rusted iron hasp, and she put her hand flat against the cold stone of the wall, and she felt, beneath her palm, the work of the man who had raised her. The door took an hour to open. The hasp had rusted shut, and the hinges had seized in their sockets, and she would not force them and risk splitting the old planks. So she worked the rust loose with a little oil from a tin in her roll, and a thin blade and patience the way Eli had taught her, easing each hinge pin a fraction at a time until the iron remembered how to move. When the door finally swung inward, it released a breath of air that had been shut inside for longer than she had been alive, cool and dry and faintly mineral, the smell of stone that has not seen weather in a generation. The room beyond was small and dim and bare, a stone floor, laid in close-fitted flags, stone walls dressed smooth and true, a single high window, barred with iron, that let in a blade of evening light and laid it across the flags like a measuring rule. Nothing else. No shelf, no crate, no sign that anything had ever been stored there. To any other eye it was an empty box of rock, worth exactly the $6 she had paid and not a cent more. Hannah did not look at the room the way another eye would have. She looked at the floor. She knelt at the threshold and let her gaze travel across the flagstones, reading them the way her father had taught her to read a laid surface, looking for the place where the work changed. And it did change. In the northeast corner, just as the letter had said, the flags were laid a little differently. The mortar lines ran a hair wider, the stones were cut to a slightly smaller size. A mason who had not built the floor would never have seen it. A mason who had been taught by the man who built it saw it at once. Someone had lifted those stones, once, and set them back. And whoever had done it had been very good, good enough that 20-some years of dust had hidden the seam from every eye. But hers, she did not lift the stones that night. She had learned not to hurry the ground. She went back to the room she rented above the feed store in Cordell, and she lay awake a long while, and in the morning she began to make herself known in the town, because she understood that whatever lay beneath that floor would mean nothing if she could not connect it to the living world above it. A truth uncovered in secret was only a private grief. A truth uncovered in the open could right a wrong. The town of Cordell had been a company town once. Varon and Slade had owned the mine, the mill, the store, and most of the houses, and for 15 years it had taken silver out of the hills and money out of the men who dug it. Then the vein had pinched out, or so the company said, and Varon and Slade had closed the mine, called in its debts, and left the valley with the town, owing it more than the town had ever earned. Families that had worked the mine for a decade walked away with nothing. Some of them had put their savings into company scrip that proved worthless the day the office closed. Others had signed papers they did not fully understand, papers that turned their wages into loans and their loans into liens. The man who had run all of it, the junior partner who became the whole of the firm when old Varon died, was named Aldous Slade. He had left Cordell a wealthy man and gone east to Helena, where he sat now on the board of a bank, and was spoken of, when he was spoken of at all, as a pillar of the territory. Hannah learned all this slowly, over weeks, by listening more than she spoke. She took her meals at Corapel's long table and let the talk move around her, and she asked her few questions at the ends of evenings when the men had grown easy. She learned it from Cora herself, who ran the boarding house and had buried a husband who broke his back in the Varon and Slade mine, and got nothing for it, not even the burial which she had paid for out of the sale of his tools. She learned it from old Tomas Reyes, who had been a timberman underground for 11 years, and now kept a few goats on a hillside and remembered everything, the names of the foreman, the depth of the last drift, the week the closing notice went up on the company store. And she learned, listening, that there was an old and stubborn belief in Cordell that the mine had not pinched out at all, that Slade had closed it while it was still rich, and salted the books to make it look spent, so that he could buy back the claims for nothing through a third party, and sell the silver quietly for years through a smelter in another county. No one had ever been able to prove it. The assay records, the one set of books that would have shown whether the vein was rich or spent, had burned in a fire at the company office the same week the mine closed, a fire that Slade himself reported and that no one had ever explained, that had taken the office and nothing on either side of it, on a night with no wind. Without the records, there was no case. There was only a valley full of people who had been robbed and could not say so, and a belief passed down at kitchen tables that hardened, over the years, into the kind of grievance a place carries the way a body carries an old break in the bone. What she did not yet know, kneeling in the powder house with her father's hammer in her hand, was that Eli Frost had built the proof into the floor. She opened the corner over 3 days. She would not rush it, and she would not damage the flags, because some instinct told her that the stones themselves might matter, and because her father's voice was in her hands, telling her that a thing taken apart carelessly can never be read. On the first day she swept the corner clean and studied it in the changing light from the high window, marking with a bit of chalk the 7 flagstones whose mortar lines ran wide. On the second day she mixed a weak solution of vinegar and water to soften the old mortar, and she brushed it into the seams and waited, and she worked a thin chisel into each joint, tapping with the ash-handled hammer in light even strokes, the sound of it small and patient in the stone room. She lifted the flagstones one at a time and set them aside in the order she took them up, the way Eli had taught her to take apart anything you might one day need to put back, laying them in a row along the wall and chalking a number on the underside of each. The work raised blisters on the heel of her hand by the end of the second day, and she wrapped them and went on. Corapel came out on the second day and watched her work and asked plainly whether she had lost her senses, paying good money for a stone shed and then spending her days digging up its floor. Hannah said only that she was looking for something her father had left her. Cora asked what kind of father left a thing under the floor of a powder house, and Hannah said, "The kind who built the powder house," and at that, the older woman went quiet. Cora Pell, who had lost a husband and 3 years of wages and most of her faith in the world, sat down on an overturned crate she dragged in from the cart track and stayed, because there was something in the young woman's steadiness that she had not seen in Cordell in a long time. She did not offer to help, and Hannah did not ask. They simply kept each other company in the small stone room while the chisel went on tapping. 2 women and a blade of light in the slow yielding of a floor that had kept its silence for 20 years. Beneath the flagstones was a bed of packed sand, fine and dry, and Hannah brushed it away with her hands, a little at a time rather than scooping it, because she did not yet know what lay below and would not risk a careless stroke. Beneath the sand, set level and true, was a flat slab of dressed stone that did not belong to the floor. It was a single piece, 2 feet on a side, fitted into a recess that had been cut for it with a precision that made her breath catch, because she knew the hand that cut such recesses had watched it work 100 times. There was no lifting the slab by hand. She studied it the way her father would have, running her fingertips along its edges, and she found at one corner a shallow groove worn for a pry, a small mercy left by a builder for whoever came after him. He had built it to be opened by someone who knew it was there. She set the flat of her widest chisel into the groove and leaned her weight on it, slow and even, adding pressure the way you coax a stubborn thing rather than fight it, and the slab rose against the sand with a sound like a held breath let go. Underneath it was a cavity lined with close-fitted stone, dry as the day it was sealed, the cold air inside it older than the town above, and in the cavity was an iron box. It was a strong box of the old kind, banded with flat iron straps and heavy at the corners, the sort a company used to carry payroll over a hard road. The iron had not rusted because the cavity had kept it dry for more than 20 years, and the lid still bore a faint trace of the black paint it had worn when it was new. Hannah lifted it out with both hands, and it was heavier than its size, and she set it on the bare sand and knelt over it a long moment without opening it, because she understood that whatever was inside it had cost her father something to hide, and that once she opened it, she could not close it again. Cora Pell stood behind her in the doorway and did not speak. The blade of light from the high window had moved across the floor, while they worked, and now lay full upon the box, and the dust they had raised hung in it, turning slowly, and for a moment the small stone room was very quiet, the way a church is quiet, and neither woman moved to break it. The lock was a good one, but Hannah had a feel for locks, and her father had left the key. Not in her hand, but in the letter, in a line she had read a dozen times and not understood until that moment, a line that said the truth was kept where the powder had been, and the key was kept where the truth could not burn. She had thought it a riddle. It was a direction. The key was inside the box's own false lid, set into the iron where fire could never reach it, and she found it by feel, and she fitted it to the lock, and she turned it. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth and dry as paper kept in a Bible, were the assay records of the Varon and Slade mine. Not copies. The originals. The ledgers the company had reported burned in the fire that closed the mine. Eli Frost had taken them or been given them by some clerk whose conscience would not let them feed the truth to a stove, and he had hidden them in the one place in the valley built to survive any fire, the stone powder magazine he himself had raised, and he had carried the knowledge of what he had done to his grave. The records were complete. 3 bound ledgers, the leather stiff but whole, the ink unfaded in the dark and the dry. They showed the assay of every load of ore taken from the mine in its last 2 years, recorded in a clerk's neat and careful hand, the date, the drift, the weight, the silver per ton. And they showed plainly, to anyone who could read a column of figures, that the vein had not pinched out at all. The mine had been richer in its final season than in any season before it. The numbers climbed as the closing approached, climbed the very months that Slade was telling the territory the silver had run dry. Varon and Slade had closed a mine that was pouring silver and reported it spent, and burned a set of books that were never burned, and left a valley full of families holding worthless scrip while the silver went out quietly by another road. Hannah sat back on her heels in the powder house and held the proof of it in her hands, and for a long moment she did not feel triumph. She felt the weight of the thing. She felt her father's 19 years of silence, the cough that took him, the letter he could not finish, the way he had looked at her sometimes across a work site as if there were something he meant to say, and had decided again to leave for later. He had built the proof into the ground and then could not bring himself to use it, because to use it would have been to admit he had helped hide it, and a man like Eli Frost would rather carry a wrong to his grave than stand in a courtroom and explain why he had waited 20 years to speak. So he had left it to her. He had trusted that she would have the patience to find it and the steadiness to use it well, and the wit to understand that the finding was the smaller part. That was the inheritance. Not the hammer, and not the silver in the hills. The trust. She did not run to town with the box. She had seen, in the records themselves, how a thing of this weight could be made to disappear, had read the very fire into the gap where two ledger pages should have followed one another, and did not, and she did not intend to give Alda Slade the chance to finish what the fire had been meant to do. She copied the ledgers by hand over the next 10 days, every figure, every date, every assay, working by lamplight in her rented room above the feed store with the door barred, her own neat hand filling page after page of a bound book she bought for the purpose. It was slow work, and her eyes ached by the end of each night, and more than once she checked a column twice, and 3 times because she knew that a single transposed figure would be the first thing Slade's lawyers reached for. The strongbox itself she carried back out to the powder house and returned to its cavity beneath the floor, and she laid the slab back level and the flagstones back over it in the order she had taken them up, matching her chalk numbers, packing the sand and tamping the mortar, so that the corner looked exactly as her father had left it. If anyone came looking, they would find an empty powder house with the look of a floor a fool had dug up and given over, and nothing in it. The proof would be in 2 places at once, the originals beneath the stone, and the copies in her own hand, and neither could be destroyed without the other surviving. That was the lesson the fire had taught her, and she had learned it without ever having seen the flames. It was Tomas Reyes who told her how to use it. She had gone to him because he remembered the names, the dates, the men who had signed the papers, and the men who had lost everything, and because, in the weeks of listening, she had come to trust the old timberman's memory more than any record in the county office. She found him on his hillside among his goats, and she sat with him on the bench outside his door, and she showed him the first page of her copied ledger. The old man took it in both hands and read it slowly, his lips moving over the figures, holding the page at arm's length in the way of men whose eyes have begun to fail them. When he reached the assay of the last season, his hands began to shake, not with anger, but with something older and quieter, the grief of a man who had spent 20 years being told that the work of his life had simply run out, and who now held in his hands the proof that it had not run out, that it had been taken. He set the page down on his knee and pressed it flat with his palm, as if to keep it from blowing away, though there was no wind. He looked up at her and asked where she had found it. She told him. He was silent a long time, looking out over the valley where the headframe of the dead mine still stood against the hills. Then he said that there was a man in Helena, a lawyer named Whitford who had grown up in Cordell and whose own father had died, owing Varon and Slade money he never borrowed, and that Whitford had been waiting his whole life for exactly this. He said it the way a man names a thing he has carried so long he had stopped expecting to set it down. Then he asked, almost shy, whether his own name was in the book. Hannah told him it was, that the loads he had timbered were assayed in the clerk's own hand, and that the figures beside them were the richest in the ledger. The old man nodded slowly and did not speak again for a while, and Hannah let the silence be, because some truths a person has to sit inside before they can be of any use. The town that had laughed at her began slowly to come to the powder-house, not all at once, for pride does not turn in a day. First Cora Pell, who had watched her dig, then Thomas Reyes, who brought 2 other old miners who remembered the last rich season underground, men with bent backs and careful hands who walked the cart track they had avoided for 20 years. Then a widow named Ellen Marsh, whose father had signed away his claim for a debt the books now proved was false, and who brought the very paper he had signed, folded, soft as cloth from years of handling. They did not come to gawk. They came because word had moved through the valley that the young woman they had called a fool had found something beneath the powder-house, and that the something had their names in it. Hannah showed them the copied ledgers spread on a plank laid across 2 crates in the small stone room. She did not make speeches. She let the figures speak, the way her father had let the ground speak, and the figures said what no living voice in Cordell had ever been able to prove. The mine had been rich, the closing had been a theft. The proof had been under their feet the whole time, sealed in the one building they had all walked past for 20 years and never once thought to enter. The lawyer Whitford came north in July. He was a careful man, gray before his time, with ink-stained fingers and a way of reading that moved his whole attention onto the page and left nothing for the room. He had built a small practice out of the kind of cases other lawyers would not take, the widow against the freight line, the homesteader against the survey. He read Hannah's copied ledgers in a single evening at Cora Pell's table by lamplight, turning the pages without a word while the supper grew cold beside him. And when he had finished, he sat back and took off his spectacles and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Then he asked to see the originals. Hannah took him out to the powder-house in the last of the light and lifted the flagstones and the slab, and showed him the iron box in its dry cavity, and the careful gray lawyer knelt on the sand and put his hand on the ledgers and wept, without sound, because he had carried his own father's ruin for 30 years and had never expected to hold the answer to it in his hands. After a while he said that with the originals, with the copies in her hand, and with the living witnesses who remembered the last season, he could bring a suit that the bank in Helena could not make disappear, because the proof now lived in too many places and too many memories to be burned a second time. He said it would be slow, he said it would be ugly, he said the men who had money would spend a great deal of it to keep this quiet. Hannah told him she had spent 19 years learning to do slow and ugly work, and that she was not afraid of either, and the lawyer looked at her a moment and then nodded as if he had taken her measure and found it sufficient. Aldous Slade never came to Cordell. That was the way of men like him. They did their work at a distance and let other men carry the weight of it. When Whitford filed the suit in the territorial court that autumn, Slade's lawyers tried first to have it dismissed and then to have the records declared forgeries. And then, when the assay clerk who had kept the ledgers was found alive and willing to swear to his own hand, they tried to settle quietly. Whitford would not settle quietly. He settled in the open, in the territorial paper, with the figures printed for the whole territory to read. The bank in Helena removed Slade from its board within the month. The suit returned to the families of Cordell a portion of what had been taken, paid out of the fortune Slade had built on the silver he had stolen, divided among the heirs of the men who had dug it. It was not everything. 20 years of interest and grief could not be paid back in coin. Yet it was the truth, made public and made permanent, and it was a debt acknowledged. And, for the people of Cordell, that was a thing they had stopped believing they would ever have. Hannah did not grow rich from it. She had not done it to grow rich, and she had seen in the careful gray lawyer's eyes the first night that he had half expected her to. Whitford offered her a share of the settlement for the finding of the records, a sum that would have set her up handsomely anywhere in the territory, and she took only what would cover her travels and a little besides, enough to keep her through the winter, and buy the tools she would need for the work she meant to do. She asked that the rest be divided among the families by the names in the ledger and the claims in the county book, the heirs of the men who had dug the silver getting the first share. And she asked that the widow Cora Pell, who had watched her dig when the rest of the town laughed, be counted among them, though her husband had signed no claim, because a man who broke his back in a mine that was robbed was owed something whether he had put his name to a paper or not. Whitford argued that the court might not see it so. Hannah said the court could see it however it liked, and that her own share was hers to give, and that she gave it to Cora. The lawyer looked at her a long moment, and then wrote it down and saw that it was done. Cora Pell, when she understood, did not thank her in words, for she was not a woman of many words either. She set a place for Hannah at the head of her table from that night on, and kept it for her as long as Hannah stayed in the valley, which was the rest of her life. Aldous Slade lived out his years in a smaller house than he had been used to, in a city where men who had once shaken his hand now crossed the street to avoid him. He was never tried, for the territory had no statute that quite fit what he had done, and he was never made to stand before the people he had robbed. Yet the records that he had reported burned were printed in full, with his name beside the figures, and they outlived him, and they were the first thing said of him after he was gone. He had built his whole life on the belief that a wrong, once buried deep enough, became the same as a thing that never happened. He learned, too late to matter, that the ground keeps what is put into it and gives it back to the right hand. The powder house still stands at the end of the cart track east of Cordell. Hannah did not sell it. She had the flagstones laid back true, and the slab set level, and the iron box she gave to Whitford for the court. But the cavity beneath the corner she left as it was, empty now and swept clean, a small stone room beneath a small stone room. She mended the roof and the door, replacing the sagging ridge beam and rehanging the heavy planks on hinges. She worked free and oiled until they swung true, and she stayed in the valley, and in time she took on the work her father had done, the reading of the ground, the building and the mending of things meant to last. She dug wells that did not fail, and laid footings that did not heave. And she taught a girl or two over the years what Eli had taught her, that you take your time with a thing, and it tells you how it was made. The men who had laughed at her at the auction did not apologize, for men of that kind rarely do, but they took off their hats when she passed, and one of them, the one who had told her she had bought an expensive cellar, brought her a job the following spring, a foundation that had begun to fail under his barn, and stood by with his hat in his hands while she read the ground and told him true what was wrong with it. She did not remind him of what he had said. The work reminded him. That was enough. On the wall of the powder house, beside the door, Hannah set a small flat stone she had dressed herself, with nothing carved on it, because her father had taught her that the things that matter least are the things that need a name carved on them. She knew what it was for. It was for Eli Frost, who had built a stone box to outlast a fire, and a lie, and his own failing courage, and who had trusted a silent 9-year-old girl with the patience to one day open it. She kept his hammer with its worn ash handle on a peg by her bench, and she used it every working day, and when her hand closed around the smooth place where his hand had worn the wood, she did not need the letter any more, because she had read it all the way to the end at last, and the end of it had only said what she already knew. Some nights in the years that followed, when the valley was quiet and the work was done, Hannah would walk the cart track out to the powder house and stand before the heavy plank door with its mended hinges, and put her hand flat against the cold stone, and feel beneath her palm the work of the man who had raised her. The town that had called her a fool had learned to call her by her name. The wrong that had lain 20 years beneath the floor had been brought into the light. And the small, ugly building that the county had nearly given away for nothing had turned out to hold the most valuable thing in the whole of the Bitterroot, which was the truth, kept dry and whole in the dark, waiting for the one hand patient enough to lift the stone. What would you have done if the whole town had laughed and the only proof you had was a folded letter and a worn hammer? Sit with that a while. And if this story stayed with you, there's another like it waiting, of a thing thrown away that turned out to hold a life.